For anyone who has seen his recent fights, it's very obvious that Conor McGregor has cardio issues. Several ideas have been put forward for why this is the case. Firstly, there is the idea that he's too much of a fast-twitch athlete, which is an idea put forward by Faraz Sahabi. I would say this is an unpopular theory, and there is reason for considerable doubt over this, which I will get into later.
McGregor, look at his stats. It's all round one knockout, round two knockout. He's fast twitch. His fast twitch muscle fibers cannot metabolize.
An alternative idea is put forward by Michael Bisping that his lack of running and training causes him to gas.
You know what you didn't see was him out on the streets running. Running. You got to run. That is the best thing ever for cardio. That is the best thing for a fight, MMA or boxing. You have to run.
A third idea that's out there is that he doesn't do enough hard anaerobic training and conditioning.
He's gone quite low intensity for my liking. He looks to be doing a lot of stuff on the bike. What we'd give McGregor, if McGregor came to our labs, high intensity conditioning drills.
A fourth idea is that his partying lifestyle and potential substance abuse issues cause him to gas. So first, to go with the idea that because Conor is such a naturally fast-twitch explosive athlete, he gasses out. The muscle fiber type of at least one MMA fighter has been studied, and it casts considerable doubt over the idea that having fast-twitch fibers will preclude you from having good cardio. I will leave a link to this free article in the description if you want to read it in further detail for yourself. Scientists from California State University took a muscle cell sample from Patrick Cummins, who is probably most famous for his beef with Daniel Cormier. Cummins, if you remember, I think he had a 7-5 UFC run, and he fought Daniel Cormier at UFC 170 as a short-notice replacement for Rashad Evans. It's only one sample, but it does provide some interesting results. The scientists found that he had roughly 66% type 2A fast-twitch muscle fibers. If you have seen Patrick Cummins' fights, you will see that he is generally a grinding wrestler who tries to weaponize cardio. So the idea that being predominantly fast-twitch will preclude you from having good cardio seems to lack merit, at least in MMA. It's conceivable that Conor has more fast-twitch muscle fibers than Patrick Cummins. When scientists analysed the muscle fiber type of former 110-meter hurdles world record holder Colin Jackson, they found around 25% of his muscle fibers were type 2X fast twitch. I think it's likely that while Conor may have more fast twitch fibers than somebody like Nate Diaz, he probably has a similar fast to slow twitch ratio to other fighters such as Patrick Cummins. If there are fighters in the UFC who are genetic outliers who may have these very fast type 2X muscle fibers, then I would look to more obvious para-athletes such as Yoel Romero or Kevin Randleman. To be fair to Conor, in his prime he cited timing and precision as the main reason for his knockouts.
He's powerful and he's fast, but precision beats power and timing beats speed, and that's what you saw there.
Senshai, a legend of Muay Thai, has also said he never fought anybody with accuracy like Conor McGregor, which has to be considered extremely high praise considering he's had hundreds of fights. So the next idea is the idea put forward by Michael Bisping that Conor gasses because he doesn't run in training. This is a debatable issue, though in my opinion, these arguments have more merit than the idea that Conor gasses because he's too fast twitch. If you look at the full quotes from Bisping, you will see that he is critical of Conor's habits of cycling as opposed to running. Comparing running to cycling, the first obvious issue is that running involves more full body engagement, whereas cycling focuses more on the lower body. So initially it might appear that running is a superior exercise as it involves more full body engagement and will allow you to work harder overall. However, when you look at the highest VO2 max results recorded in history, many of the top 10 are cyclists. In fact, the highest VO2 max recorded in history belongs to a Norwegian cyclist called Oskar Svensson. So cycling is clearly an effective way of increasing the body's overall capability to process oxygen. In terms of low intensity, the evidence would suggest that low intensity exercise can be effective for stimulating the body's underlying endurance adaptations. To summarise the benefits of low intensity exercise on endurance, I will defer to Alex Hutchinson. He is an endurance athlete himself and a professional sports science journalist specialising in endurance.
And I think everyone would probably agree that, like, hey, the perfect training plan is you get up at 7 a.m. and you start sprinting, and you keep sprinting till 7 p.m. And then you wake up the next day and do it. And 12 hours a day of running as fast as you can, you're going to get very fit. But no one can do that. So there's this idea that emerged about 20 years ago, thanks to a guy named Steven Seiler, who's an American based in, or at least he was an American based in Norway for the last 30 years or so, 20 some years, that basically emerged from like looking at the training diaries of elite athletes in a bunch of different endurance sports, from rowing to skiing to running to swimming, saying, how do these people train? If you do a training intensity distribution, how much training did they do that's hard? How much training did they do that's easy? And the observation was that across sports, across disciplines, whether you're talking about a miler who's out there for 4 minutes or a marathoner who's out there for 2 hours, or even I think Ironman triathletes,
Then I go out and do a run between, it varies, 5 to 7 miles, 5 to 8 miles, because that's cool down. That's when it's cool down period.
Across a surprisingly wide range of activities and sports, athletes tend to do a ton of low intensity training, a small amount of very high intensity training, and not much in the middle.
So taking the words of Hutchinson, you could construct either a 3 or 5 heart rate zone based pyramid of which to base your training. The underlying point is that basically all endurance athletes spend the majority of their time in the lower heart rate zones. The issue with cycling is that whilst it may be as effective as running or other endurance activities such as cross-country skiing for increasing your overall ability to process oxygen, it is much less time efficient. If you look at how most professional cyclists train, it is common for them to put in 6 hours of cycling a day, whereas most runners will never train more than 2 hours in a day. To understand why a 30-minute bike ride may provide inferior benefits to a 30-minute run, you have to understand a phenomenon known as cardiac drift. If you imagine you run for 30 minutes at 8-minute mile pace, then you may think initially that the body will adjust to running at an equally steady heart rate. However, in truth, as the body fatigues, the heart will have to work increasingly hard just to maintain a steady pace. So if you start a run working in the zone 2 heart rate zone of a 5-zone model, by the time you get to the 15 to 20 minute mark, you may cross over into the zone 3 heart rate zone. So applying that to a professional cyclist's workouts, during a 3-hour ride, they may start the bike ride in zone 1 and finish in zone 3 or 4.
So the reason I wrote this article is that there was a pro and con debate in a journal called Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, featuring two teams of well-known scientists debating on about whether polarized training is good. And one of the things they ended up debating was like, well, it shouldn't be called polarized training; it should be called pyramidal training, because if you accurately characterize the training zones with like heart rate, then you'd find that actually these athletes spend more time in zone 2 than zone 3. So it's the opposite of this avoiding zone 2. But what the original authors said is like, we don't care about we're not trying to add up every heartbeat. What we're saying is that if you ask an athlete, are you going easy, medium, or hard today? They do a mostly easy, a little bit of medium, and a little bit more hard.
However, the issue I would take with what Bisping says is that he seems to see running as a sort of magic exercise. If you look at Kamaru Usman, for instance, he has been able to use his cardio as a weapon in UFC fights, despite him not being able to run in training.
And wake up at 6 a.m. and I can go for a freaking 5-mile run like that with nothing. Now I can't do that anymore. God, my knees. I've had 5 knee surgeries.
There are various other pieces of gym equipment which can be used to train cardio, which can have even more full body involvement than running. So in my opinion, there isn't anything magical about running. So next, to go over the idea described by the boxing science team out of Sheffield, UK, that McGregor does too much low intensity exercise.
What we'd give McGregor, if McGregor came to our labs, high intensity conditioning drills.
A study out of the University of Ontario in Canada showed that intervals and steady state endurance training caused similar improvements in cardio, albeit by bringing about different adaptations in the body. I'm going to go through it briefly here. You can pause the video if you don't have enough time to read the excerpts on screen. You can also find a link in the description if you want to examine it in further detail. Looking at the training, the subjects in the sprint interval training group trained 3 times a week. Their sessions consisted of 30-second sprints with 4-minute rests, repeated 4 times for the first 4 weeks, and then bumped up to 6 intervals for the final 2 weeks. The endurance training group, in contrast, ran for 30 to 60 minutes depending on the point in the study. I think it's worth pointing out that these were recreationally trained subjects, so the speed that they were running at was likely significantly below the speed you would expect a UFC championship caliber fighter to run at. Skipping to the results, the classic endurance group is labelled on this graph as ET on the left. As you can see from their pre and post scores, the majority of subjects in the endurance training group significantly increased their maximal cardiac output. If you look at the sprint interval training group on the right, you can see the lines are much flatter. So by comparison, the sprint interval training group was not effective at increasing the amount of blood the heart was able to pump. If you look at the next result, the scientists compared the amount of oxygen in the blood in the arteries compared to the amount of oxygen in the blood in the veins. In this case, the sprint interval training was effective at causing a greater difference as compared to the pre-training state. As the oxygenated blood travels to the muscle via the arteries and returns to the heart/lungs via the veins, it was inferred that the sprint interval training group must have made the muscle more effective at using the oxygen that was provided. If you look at this excerpt from the results section, the scientists find that the sprint interval training improves the muscle's ability to use oxygen by triggering adaptations in the enzymes and mitochondria within the muscle. So having seen that intervals and steady state endurance training can be an either-or situation for fixing cardio issues, I think it comes down to how the interval sessions fit within your overall training. I think it's worth pointing out that whilst a professional endurance athlete may need to get the most out of both intervals and steady state training, that level of endurance is not going to be necessary for an MMA fighter, though cardio is still a significant factor. There is an argument out there of sorts that steady state cardio may foster slow movement. However, a counter argument is that as you don't use fast twitch muscle fibers during steady state cardio, if you are training twice a day, the fast twitch fibers will be fresh for the second session. For instance, if you look at Manny Pacquiao, he runs in the morning for his hard sparring days, yet he is still very explosive during his sparring. If he did an interval training session, then some of his fast twitch muscle fibers may be too fatigued to be used during his sparring, as the fastest twitch muscle fibers can take up to 72 hours to recover from a workout. So I think it comes down to how the rest of your training is playing out. If you are doing a light technical skill workout, then that may complement an interval session elsewhere in the day. On the flip side, if you're doing a very intense sparring or pad work, then steady state cardio may be a better complement. In the case of McGregor, he seems to do a mixture of hard sparring, as made obvious when he knocked down Paulie Malignaggi, and a slower paced, more technical style of sparring. The final factor may be Conor's overall focus and adherence to training. I won't expand on this too much, but he's rumoured to have substance abuse issues, and if he's turning up to workouts hungover or skipping workouts, then that's bound to eventually take its toll. So in conclusion, there may be several factors as to why Conor has had cardio issues. The only argument that's out there that doesn't make sense to me is the idea that he's too fast twitch to get good cardio. I think that's something that can explain the elite of the elite in endurance events or in sprints, but will only explain a mild endurance or speed bias in MMA. Intervals or steady state cardio may be an either-or situation. Lastly, for those who have found this video overcomplicating things, I will say the things I found surprising before looking into it are that endurance athletes don't necessarily go 100% all the time, and that 30 seconds on, 4 minutes off may produce solid results. Let me know in the comments the main factor that you think is hindering Conor's cardio.